In the southern reaches of Andhra Pradesh, nestled amidst the rolling hills of the Chittor district, lies the town of Madanapal. It is a place usually known for its quiet dignity, a hub of education and agriculture where life moves at a steady, predictable pace. It is a town where reputation matters, where neighbors know each other's business, and where success is measured by the degrees on your wall and the gold medals in your cabinet. And in this town, in the calm, upscale neighborhood of Shivanagar, there stood a house that was the very definition of success. It was a newly constructed residence, a three-story testament to a lifetime of hard work and academic brilliance. To the outsider, this house was a fortress of intellect. It was the home of the Naidu family, a household that commanded instant respect from anyone who walked past its gates. This wasn't just a wealthy family. This was a family of geniuses. At the head of this household sat Dr. V. Purushotham Naidu. He was a man of science, a vice principal at the Government Degree College for Women. He held a Ph.D. in chemistry, a subject grounded in the laws of nature, reactions, and tangible proof. He was the kind of man who had spent decades teaching students that for every action, there is a reaction, and that the world is governed by logic. Beside him was his wife, V. Padmaja. If Purushotham was the chemist, Padmaja was the mathematician. She was a gold medalist in mathematics, a subject of pure reason and absolute truths. She served as the principal and correspondent of a highly reputed private school, known for churning out top-tier students for IIT entrance exams. Together, they were the power couple of Madanapal's academic circle, pillars of the community who had dedicated their lives to logic, education, and the molding of young minds. But their legacy didn't stop with them. It lived on, even more brightly, in their two daughters. The elder daughter, Alekhya, was 27 years old. She was the quiet brilliance of the family, a young woman who had completed her post-graduation in forest management from a prestigious institute in Bhopal. She was preparing for the civil services, aiming for the Indian Forest Service. She was sharp, disciplined, and carried the weight of her parents' expectations with grace. Then there was the younger soul, Divya, 22 years old. If Alekhya was the mind, Divya was the spirit. She was vibrant, artistic, and incredibly talented. She had completed her BBA but had chosen to follow a path of melody, enrolling in the KM Music Conservatory in Mumbai, the institute founded by the legendary A.R. Rahman. She was a musician, a singer, a girl with a song in her heart and a future that seemed to stretch out endlessly before her. To the neighbors in Shivanagar, the Naidus were the perfect family. They were the people you pointed to when you told your children to study hard. Look at them, they would say. Look at how dignified they are. Look at how much they have achieved. The house was always quiet, disciplined, and seemingly peaceful. It was a temple of modern education where science and mathematics reigned supreme. There was no reason to suspect that behind those freshly painted walls, the very logic that built their lives was beginning to fracture. We often assume that madness is a creature of the uneducated, that superstition can only take root in minds that do not know better. We think that degrees, PhDs, and gold medals are a shield against the darkness. But we are wrong. As the year 2020 began to draw to a close, the Naidu residence, this house of intellect, was about to become the stage for a horror so profound, so devoid of logic, that it would shatter the sanity of an entire nation. The perfect family was about to face a test that no textbook could prepare them for. The darkness was not coming from the outside. It was already inside. waiting to be awoken. The year 2020 descended upon the world like a heavy shroud, bringing with it a silence that was both deafening and terrifying. It was the year of the pandemic, a time when fear became the dominant language of humanity. For most, the lockdown was a temporary inconvenience, a pause button hit on the chaotic rhythm of daily life. But for the Naidu family, inside the walls of their three-story home in Shivanagar, the lockdown was not just a government mandate. It became the catalyst for a slow, terrifying implosion. When the pandemic struck, the daughters returned to the safety of the nest. Divya, whose heart beat to the rhythm of Mumbai and her music, was forced to leave the vibrant energy of the conservatory and return to the quiet of Madanapal. Alekhya, too, was bound to the house, her preparations for the civil services now confined to her study room. Suddenly, four brilliant, intense minds were locked together in a single space, cut off from the grounding reality of the outside world. At first, their precautions seemed sensible, prudent measures taken by educated people who understood the biology of a virus. But as the weeks stretched into months, prudence began to curdle into paranoia. The first sign that the walls were closing in came when the domestic help was barred from entering. The maid, who had served the household faithfully, was told her services were no longer required. It wasn't just a matter of social distancing, it was a total severance. The gates of the Naidu residence, usually open to the comings and goings of academic life, were shut tight. The family began to retreat further and further into themselves. They stopped stepping out for groceries, relying instead on deliveries or minimal contact. The neighbors, initially understanding, began to notice a shift in the atmosphere surrounding the house. The friendly waves and casual greetings that were once exchanged over the boundary walls ceased entirely. The house stood silent, imposing, like a dormant volcano waiting to erupt. It is said that isolation is the breeding ground for delusion, and in the case of the Naidus, this proved tragically true. Without the checks and balances of external society, without colleagues to debate with, without friends to laugh with, their reality began to shrink until it contained only the four of them. They created an invisible wall around their lives, a barrier that nothing from the outside could penetrate. Inside this echo chamber, their conversations began to change. The logic of chemistry and mathematics, which had served Purushotham and Padmaja so well in their careers, began to warp. The fear of the virus, a tangible biological threat, slowly morphed into a fear of something far more abstract and dangerous. The intense academic pressure the family was used to didn't disappear. It just changed direction. Instead of channeling their focus into exams and lectures, they turned that laser-sharp intensity toward each other and toward their internal thoughts. The house became a pressure cooker. The daughters, highly educated and impressionable, looked to their parents for guidance in this frightening new world. But the parents were drifting away from the shore of reason. Padmaja, the gold medalist, the woman of precision, began to exhibit signs of immense stress, channeling her energy into rigid controls over the household. The boundaries between protecting her family from a virus and protecting them from evil began to blur. By the time the calendar turned to 2021, the Naidu family had effectively seceded from the rest of Madanapal. They were physically present in Shivanagar, but mentally, they were drifting in a void of their own creation. The neighbors saw only the closed windows and the locked gates, unaware that behind them, the family was shedding their identities as scientists and students. The logical, structured world they had built was dissolving, and in the vacuum left by the absence of the outside world, something ancient and dark was beginning to take root. The invisible wall was complete, and now there was no way out, and more importantly, no one to look in. As the doors of the world remained shut, the doors of the mind were flung wide open, not to the sunlight of reason, but to the blinding glare of a warped spirituality. In the silence of their self-imposed exile, the textbooks of chemistry and mathematics were slowly pushed aside, replaced by the heavy, mystic tomes of spiritual philosophy. The Naidu family, starving for meaning in a world that seemed to be falling apart, turned their voracious intellects toward the metaphysical. They began to devour the teachings of Osho, the silence of Meher Baba, and the ancient, esoteric texts of Indian mythology. But where a balanced mind finds peace in these teachings, a mind under siege finds only fuel for a growing fire. It wasn't a sudden jump, but a slow, hypnotic descent. Padmaja, the matriarch, became the conductor of this new, terrifying orchestra. The woman who had spent her life proving theorems began to speak in riddles. She became convinced that the family was not just surviving a pandemic, but that they were chosen for something far greater. The logic of numbers was replaced by the logic of the cosmos, but it was a cosmos of her own invention. She began to preach to her husband and daughters that they were special, that they possessed a divine energy that set them apart from the ordinary mortals outside their gates. The atmosphere in the house shifted from academic discipline to ritualistic fervor. The air, once smelling of old paper and coffee, now hung heavy with the smoke of incense and the sound of constant chanting. They spoke of the Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness and sin, and became obsessed with the idea of the Satya Yuga, the age of truth and purity. But this wasn't just a theological discussion. For them, it became a physical reality. They believed they were the catalysts, the instruments chosen by the divine to end the age of darkness and usher in the age of light. Alekhya, the elder daughter, the aspiring civil servant, became the most fervent acolyte of her mother's new vision. Her social media, once a typical reflection of a young woman's life, began to darken with cryptic messages. She posted quotes from Osho, musings on life and death, and strange, philosophical rants that hinted at a mind breaking loose from its moorings. She wrote about the nature of reality, about the illusions of the material world. To her few remaining followers online, it looked like deep spirituality. In reality, it was a distress signal from a sinking ship. She began to see herself not as Alekhya, the forest management graduate, but as a spiritual entity, a being of power. Divya, the musician, struggled the most. There were moments of resistance, moments where the vibrant girl from Mumbai tried to push back against the suffocating blanket of her mother's delusions. But the isolation was absolute. With no one to validate her reality, her resistance crumbled. She, too, was pulled into the vortex. The family began to feed off each other's energy, a classic case of folie à deux, or in this case, a madness shared by four. They stopped sleeping in their bedrooms, gathering instead in the prayer room, spending hours, then days, in deep, trance-like states. They believed they were receiving messages. Purushotham Naidu, the man of science, found his resistance eroded by the sheer intensity of the three women he loved. He, who should have been the anchor of reason, became adrift in the storm. He began to believe that his wife was not just Padmaja, but a vessel for the divine. When she spoke, he didn't hear his wife, he heard a goddess. They convinced themselves that the world outside was impure, that their house was a sanctuary, a womb from which a new world would be born. The delusion was complete. They were no longer a family in a house. They were gods in a temple, waiting for the moment of transfiguration. And as January progressed, they believed the time had finally come to prove their divinity. As the third week of January arrived, the air around the Naidu residence grew thick with a palpable electric tension. It was no longer just silence that emanated from the house. It was a vibration, a low-frequency hum of impending disaster that seemed to unsettle even the stray dogs on the street. To the casual observer, the house looked the same, imposing, quiet, shut tight against the winter's sun. But for those who lived closest, the perfect family was beginning to crack, and the sounds escaping through the walls were the first fissures. The neighbors, who had grown used to the family's reclusive nature, began to notice disturbing irregularities. It started with the sounds. Late at night, when the rest of Shivanagar was asleep, the rhythmic drone of chanting would drift from the Naidu house. It wasn't the peaceful, melodic recitation of morning prayers. It was frantic, desperate, and loud. The voices were strained, rising in pitch and intensity, sounding less like devotion and more like a battle cry. They were trying to ward something off, trying to scream away an invisible darkness that they believed had breached their sanctuary. Inside, the routine of daily life had completely collapsed. The concept of day and night had vanished. Meals were skipped or eaten at odd hours. The food merely fuel for bodies that were being pushed to their limits in spiritual warfare. Padmaja, her eyes wide and unblinking, began to pace the house like a caged tigress. She spoke of impurities that had entered their home, invisible stains that needed to be washed away. The logic of the mathematician was gone, replaced by the terrified conviction of a zealot. She told her husband and daughters that the time of testing was upon them, that the universe was watching, and that they had to be pure to survive the transition to the Satya Yuga. Alekhya and Divya, exhausted and malnourished from days of fasting and intense rituals, were caught in the slipstream of their mother's mania. They were no longer just participants. They were subjects of the experiment. The house became a maze of ritualistic hazards. Strange objects were placed in specific corners to block negative energy. The family began to discard their clothes, believing that the material fibers were binding them to the earthly plane, preventing their spiritual ascension. They moved through the house in varying states of undress, their bodies painted with turmeric and vermilion, looking less like a modern family and more like figures from a fever dream of ancient mythology. On January 21st and 22nd, the behavior escalated from strange to alarming. Neighbors reported hearing shouting, not arguments, but declarative screams. Shiva is coming. The work is done. Phrases that made no sense to the listeners, but held catastrophic meaning for the speakers. Purushotham Naidu was seen briefly in the compound, looking haggard, his eyes darting around nervously, as if he were guarding a terrible secret. He was no longer the vice principal. He was the gatekeeper of a temple that was rapidly becoming a slaughterhouse. He turned away anyone who came near, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and reverence for the process happening inside. The atmosphere inside the house was one of terrified anticipation. They believed that the evil was not just around them, but in them. Specifically, Padmaja began to focus her gaze on her daughters. She started to see their youthful energy not as vitality, but as a source of chaos. The girls, in their delusion, began to agree. They spoke of the demons inside them, of the need to be cleansed. The love between mother and daughter was twisted into a grotesque shape where causing pain became an act of salvation. By the evening of Saturday, January 23rd, the house was a powder keg. The chanting had become a continuous, wailing roar. The family had worked themselves into a collective trance, a state of psychosis so deep that reality had ceased to exist. They were on the precipice of the event horizon. The neighbors, unsettled and confused, debated calling the authorities but hesitated. After all, this was the Naidu family, the most educated people in the neighborhood. Surely, it was just an intense prayer session. They went to sleep that night, pulling their blankets tight, trying to ignore the sounds of a family tearing itself apart, unaware that the sun would rise on a scene of unimaginable horror. The warning signs had been screaming for days, but the silence of respect had deafened the world to the truth. Sunday, January 24th, 2021, dawned over Madinapal with the lazy, golden indifference that Sundays often possess. The streets of Shivanagar were quiet, the morning air crisp and filled with the distant sounds of temple bells and birdsong. It was the kind of morning that invited slow breakfasts and leisurely reading of the newspaper. But inside the Naidu residence, the sun did not bring light. It brought the final, blinding clarity of madness. The long night of chanting had not ended. It had merely evolved into a state of terrified purpose. The family had passed the point of no return. They were no longer waiting for a sign. They believed they were the sign. The atmosphere inside the house was electric, charged with a manic energy that defied physical exhaustion. They had barely slept, barely eaten, yet they moved with a jerky, frenetic strength. To them, this was not a Sunday. It was the day of judgment. It was the moment the Satya Yuga would finally break through the crust of the earth, and it would start right here, in their living room. The delusion had crystallized into a specific, horrific conviction. The physical body was merely a shell, a container for the divine, but also a trap for the demons that were tormenting them. To be free, to become the gods they believed they were, the shell had to be broken. Alekhya and Divya, the two brilliant daughters, were now deep in the throes of the shared psychosis. They were not cowering in corners, hiding from abusive parents. It was far more tragic than that. They were active participants in their own unraveling. They stood in the center of the room, their eyes glazed, their minds completely severed from the reality of the 21st century. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that a miracle was about to occur. They were convinced that death was not the end, but a revolving door, a necessary, temporary step to shake off the evil that had attached itself to them. The younger daughter, Divya, was particularly agitated. In the twisted narrative they had constructed, she believed she had an entity inside her that needed to be expelled. She wasn't afraid of dying because she didn't believe she would stay dead. "I will come back," she told them. "I will return purer." It was a heartbreaking surrender of logic to faith, a testament to how deeply the human mind can break under isolation and fear. The parents, Purushotham and Padmaja, looked at their children not with hatred, but with a terrifying, warped love. They believed they were saving them. They believed they were about to perform the ultimate act of parental devotion, granting their children immortality. The house was strewn with the debris of their rituals, photos of deities, turmeric powder, flowers, and silver vessels. But amidst these religious symbols lay the instruments of their destruction: dumbbells used for exercise and a trident, a trishul, the symbol of Lord Shiva. These were no longer gym equipment or religious artifacts. In their hands, they had become surgical tools for a spiritual operation. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the judging eyes of the sun. The time for chanting was over. The time for action had arrived. Around noon, a strange calm descended upon them. It was the calm of the executioner who believes he is doing God's work. They stripped themselves of fear, stripped themselves of doubt. They convinced themselves that the pain would be fleeting, a small price to pay for the glory of resurrection. They were ready to challenge the very laws of life and death. The neighbors outside went about their chores, cooking lunch, watching television, completely unaware that just a few meters away, a family of geniuses was preparing to tear the soul out of their home. The stage was set. The actors were in place. And the first act of the tragedy was about to begin with the youngest, the vibrant, musical soul of the house, Divya. The sun had climbed to its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows across the town of Madanapal. But inside the Naidu household, the light of reason had been completely extinguished. It was time. The moment of cleansing could no longer be delayed. The focus of the family's collective delusion narrowed entirely onto the younger daughter, Divya. In their warped reality, she was the one who harbored the most potent impurity, the one who needed to be freed first. The procession moved to the upper floor, to the prayer room that had become the epicenter of their madness. This was not a struggle in the traditional sense. Divya, the girl who had once dreamed of becoming a famous singer, was not dragged screaming to her death by strangers. She was led there by the people she loved most in the world. She was in a state of high agitation, a mix of terrifying vulnerability and manic acceptance. She had been convinced, through days of relentless psychological pressure, that the pain she was about to endure was the only way to save her soul. She was told that the demon inside her had to be beaten out, that her physical form had to be destroyed so that her true, divine self could emerge. They laid her down. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of camphor and the sound of frantic, whispered prayers. Padmaja, the mother, took the lead. She picked up the dumbbell, a heavy, cold piece of iron that had once been used to build strength, now repurposed as a tool of deliverance. Purushotham, the father, the man who had spent his life teaching the laws of chemistry, stood by. He did not stop her. In his mind, he wasn't watching his daughter die. He was watching a surgical procedure to remove a spiritual cancer. The first blow fell. It was a dull, sickening thud that should have shattered the spell they were under, but instead, it only deepened it. To them, the cries of pain were not the cries of their child. They were the screams of the demon leaving the body. Go. Leave her. They chanted, their voices rising with every strike. The brutality was absolute. The violence was intimate and devastating. The dumbbell rose and fell, again and again, driven by a hysterical strength that Padmaja should not have possessed. They struck her head, the very vessel of her dreams and music, believing they were cracking open a shell to release the light within. Divya's struggle was brief. The sheer force of the assault, combined with her weakened state from days of fasting, overwhelmed her. The room, which should have been a sanctuary, became a slaughterhouse. Blood, red, real, and undeniably human, stained the floor, the walls, the ritual items. But the family did not see blood. They saw the impurity flowing out. When she finally went still, when the last breath left her battered body, a terrifying silence did not descend. Instead, there was a sense of accomplishment. Padmaja stood over the lifeless body of her younger daughter, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a terrifying triumph. "It is done," she whispered. "She is free." They did not mourn. There were no tears of grief. How could there be grief when they believed she wasn't gone? They covered her body, not with a shroud of death, but with the reverence of a sleeper who would soon wake. They truly, deeply believed that Divya was now in a temporary state of suspension, that the ritual had worked, and that in a matter of hours she would rise again, cleansed, divine, and more powerful than before. The first sacrifice had been made. The demon was gone, but the hunger of the delusion was not yet sated. The elder daughter, Alekhya, stood watching, trembling not with fear, but with anticipation. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was now her turn to be saved. The death of Divya did not break the spell, it sealed it. In any sane world, the sight of a beloved child lying broken and bloody on the floor would have shattered the delusion instantly, bringing the crushing weight of reality crashing down. But the Naidu house was no longer part of the sane world. It was a pocket dimension of madness where blood was water and death was merely a door. Alekhya, the elder daughter, the brilliant aspirant for the civil services, stood witnessing the carnage not with horror, but with a terrifying, serene acceptance. She did not scream. She did not run for the door. She looked at her sister's still form and saw only peace. She saw a successful extraction. In fact, the tragedy of Alekhya is perhaps even deeper than that of her sister. While Divya had struggled, Alekhya had surrendered long before the physical blow landed. She had been the one reading Osho, the one diving deepest into the mystical abyss. In that blood-soaked room, she turned to her parents, her eyes burning with the same fever that gripped them. "I am next," her demeanor suggested. "Cleanse me too. Do not leave me behind in this world of demons." She believed that the apocalypse was happening outside, that the world was ending, and that the only way to survive was to shed the mortal coil and rise as a being of pure energy. She didn't want to be left alone in a house of corpses. She wanted to join the resurrection. The ritual began again. The sun was dipping lower now, the shadows stretching long and distorted across the walls, mimicking the twisted reality of the family. Alekhya prepared herself. She removed her clothes, stripping away the illusions of the material world, just as they believed the soul must be stripped of the body. She lay down near the spot where her sister had fallen, a willing sacrifice on the altar of their shared psychosis. There was no struggle, no chase. It was a consensual execution between parent and child, a pact sealed in madness. Purushotham and Padmaja, their hands already stained, their minds fractured beyond repair, lifted the dumbbell once more. They were exhausted, panting, physically drained by the emotional and physical exertion of killing their own flesh and blood. But the mania drove them on. They believed they were completing a divine set, a duality of death that would lead to a duality of life. Alekhya, the girl who was supposed to protect forests, who was supposed to serve the nation, looked up at her mother, the woman who had given her life, and accepted her death. The blows came. The silence of the house was broken again, but this time the cries were fewer. Alekhya accepted the violence as a necessary transition. The iron struck, dismantling the brilliant brain that had memorized statutes and scientific principles, reducing a lifetime of potential to a tragic memory. Within moments, the deed was done. Alekhya lay still beside Divya. Two sisters, two bright flames, extinguished in the span of a single afternoon by the very people who had kindled them. Now, the house was truly silent. The chanting stopped. The frantic energy that had driven them for hours suddenly dissipated, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating stillness. Purushotham and Padmaja sat amidst the carnage, surrounded by the bodies of their children. But they did not weep. They did not call an ambulance. They sat in a vigil of terrifying hope. They cleaned the faces of their daughters, arranged their limbs, and waited. They whispered to the bodies, "Wake up. It is time. The sun is setting. Shiva is coming." They expected the chests to rise. They expected the eyes to flutter open, clearing away the glaze of death to reveal the glowing irises of goddesses. They watched the clock, not realizing that time had run out for them. They waited for a miracle that biology would never grant. As the afternoon faded into the evening, the reality of the physical world began to creep in at the edges. The blood began to dry. The bodies began to cool. But the parents held the line. They paced around the bodies, singing softly, commanding the universe to bend to their will. They were alone in the dark, guarding the dead, convinced that they were merely the midwives of a glorious rebirth. The sun went down on Sunday, burying the house in darkness, concealing the horror from the eyes of the world. But the sound of what they had done was about to breach the walls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging Madinapal into the velvet grip of twilight, the silence inside the Naidu residence began to leak out, transforming into a different kind of noise, a noise of confusion and erratic desperation that finally pierced the invisible wall they had built. For days, the neighbors in Shivanagar had turned a deaf ear, respecting the privacy of the esteemed professor and the principal. But Sunday evening brought a shift in the atmosphere that could no longer be ignored. The chanting had stopped, but it was replaced by something far more unsettling. The sound of a man's voice, trembling and incoherent, drifting over the compound wall, and the eerie, total darkness of a house that should have been lit up for the evening. It wasn't the neighbors who made the first move, but Purushotham Naidu himself. In the midst of the carnage, deeply retrenched in his delusion, but perhaps feeling the first cold prickle of fear as his daughters remained motionless, he reached out. He picked up his phone and dialed a colleague. It was a cry for witness, not for help. He didn't say, "I have killed my children." He spoke in the fractured logic of the trance. He mumbled about miracles, about the Kali Yuga ending, about his daughters sleeping only to wake up as divine beings. "Something great is happening," he reportedly told the listener. "We have cleansed them." The colleague on the other end of the line froze. The words were nonsensical, yet the tone was terrifyingly grave. This was Dr. Purushotham, a man of science, speaking like a lunatic. The colleague immediately sensed that the situation had spiraled from eccentric spirituality into dangerous reality. He didn't wait. He alerted others, and soon, the whispers in the neighborhood turned into frantic phone calls. Something is wrong at the Naidu house. Something is terribly wrong. Outside the gates, a small crowd began to gather. The bravery of the community is often hesitant, paused by the fear of overstepping boundaries. But the dread radiating from the house was palpable. They stood at a safe distance, watching the dark windows. They could hear Padmaja's voice now, not chanting, but shouting at unseen entities, her voice raw and scraping against the night air. She was yelling at the spirits, yelling at the world to stay away, protecting the gestation period of her children. To the people standing on the road, it sounded like the ravings of a woman possessed. The decision was made. The police were called. The station house officer of the Madinapal Town Police Station received the alert. A possible disturbance, domestic violence, or something stranger at the professor's house. The sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the quiet Sunday night. That sound, usually a comfort, felt like an intrusion to the couple inside. They were waiting for gods, not the police. They were waiting for resurrection, not an investigation. As the police jeep turned the corner into Shivanagar, the headlights swept across the imposing structure of the Naidu home. The neighbors stepped back, allowing the law to take over. The officers approached the gate, expecting a domestic dispute, perhaps a fight born of lockdown frustration. They had no idea they were walking into a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The gate was locked. The house was a fortress of silence again. The officers banged on the door, their shouts demanding entry echoing in the street. Inside, Purushotham and Padmaja heard the banging not as the law, but as the demons coming to disrupt the ritual. "Don't let them in," Padmaja screamed. "They will ruin the work. They will stop the waking." But the reality of the world has a way of breaking down even the strongest doors. The police, sensing the gravity of the situation and hearing the erratic screams from within, prepared to force their way in. The neighbors held their breath, watching from the shadows, knowing that whatever was behind those doors was about to change the history of their town forever. The vigil was over. The nightmare was about to be unveiled. The heavy wooden doors of the Naidu residence, which had stood as guardians of the family's privacy for so long, finally gave way. The police, realizing that knocking would yield no result, forced their entry into the house. As the officers stepped over the threshold, they were not met with the familiar, sterile smell of a well-kept upper-middle-class home. Instead, they were hit by a thick, suffocating wave of incense, camphor, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of fresh blood. The air was heavy, stagnant, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for hours. The ground floor was eerie, filled with the scattered remnants of days of chaotic living, clothes strewn about, books on mysticism left open, and half-eaten food. But it was the energy of the place that made the officer's skin crawl. It was silent, but it felt loud, vibrating with the echoes of the madness that had unfolded just hours before. Moving cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, they made their way deeper into the residence. They found Purushotham Naidu in the living area. The man, a respected vice principal, a figure of authority and logic, was sitting in a chair, looking utterly lost. He wasn't violent. He wasn't resisting. He looked like a man who had been shipwrecked on an island of his own making. He was dazed, muttering incoherently, his eyes unfocused, staring at a reality that only he could see. But the true horror lay further in. Following the trail of ritualistic debris, turmeric powder, kumkum, and flowers scattered across the floor like a twisted confetti, the police reached the puja room. There, the scene that awaited them was something that would sear itself into their memories forever. Lying on the floor, surrounded by photos of deities and the paraphernalia of worship, were the bodies of Alekhya and Divya. They were not just bodies in the forensic sense. They were arranged. They were covered in red saris, swathed in crimson cloth as if they were deities waiting to be unveiled. The officers, hardened by years of dealing with crime, recoiled. The violence inflicted upon the young women was brutal and undeniable. The bludgeoning wounds were severe, the blood pooling around their heads, staining the ritual clothes dark and stiff. Nearby lay the weapons of this spiritual war, the blood-stained dumbbells, heavy and cold, and the trident, the trishul, leaning against the wall as a silent witness. It was a scene of medieval sacrifice played out in a modern living room. The juxtaposition was jarring. The mundane modernity of the house, the tiles, the painted walls, clashing violently with the ancient, bloody ritual on the floor. Padmaja was there, hovering near the bodies. Unlike her husband's dazed stupor, she was vibrating with a terrifying energy. She blocked the officer's path, not with physical force, but with the sheer intensity of her delusion. She screamed at them, her voice cracking with desperation. "Do not touch them," she wailed. "They are sleeping. You will disturb the energy. They are about to wake up." She wasn't trying to hide a crime. She was trying to protect a miracle. She truly believed that. The police were interrupting the resurrection process, that their boots and their radios were contaminating the sacred space she had created. The police were stunned. They had expected a murderer trying to flee, or a grieving parent broken by a fit of rage. They did not expect this. A mother fiercely guarding the corpses of her children, waiting for them to breathe again. The officers had to physically maneuver around her, their movements gentle but firm, trying to secure the crime scene without triggering a violent outburst from the clearly unstable woman. They checked for pulses, though they knew it was futile. The bodies were cold. Rigor mortis was setting in. The sleep was permanent. As the reality of the double homicide set in, the officers looked at each other in disbelief. These were the daughters of the town's elite. This was the home of a PhD scholar and a gold medalist. How did this happen? How did logic rot so thoroughly? The house felt like a tomb, a monument to a belief system that had devoured its creators. The police began the grim task of securing the area, radioing for backup and forensics, their voices low, respectful of the dead, but laced with a profound, shaking horror. They had entered the house to stop a disturbance. They had found a graveyard of sanity. The chaotic scene inside the house reached its crescendo not with a confession, but with a proclamation that chilled the blood of every officer present. As the police moved to recover the bodies of Alekhya and Divya, Padmaja Naidu did not break down in grief. She stood tall, her eyes blazing with a terrifying, otherworldly conviction. She looked at the uniformed men not as figures of authority, but as ignorant mortals interfering with cosmic work. "I am Shiva," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls that had witnessed the slaughter. "My husband is mere creation. Corona was born from my hair. Do not touch them. If you keep them for one more day, they will wake up." It was a confrontation between the laws of the state and the laws of a fractured mind. Padmaja was adamant that the ritual was incomplete only because of the intrusion. She demanded the police leave the bodies until the morning, insisting that with the rising sun, her daughters would rise too. It took immense effort and patience for the authorities to navigate this minefield of madness. They weren't just arresting suspects. They were dismantling a reality. Purushotham Naidu, the man of science, seemed to drift in and out of the delusion, occasionally murmuring that they had been fooled, that perhaps the miracle was delayed, while at other times seeming to grasp the enormity of the horror, his face crumbling into a mask of confusion and despair. When the bodies were finally carried out, covered in sheets, the spell began to fray at the edges, but it did not break. The couple was taken into custody, not to a prison cell initially, but into a world that looked at them with a mixture of hatred, pity, and bewilderment. As they were led away, Padmaja continued to rant, warning everyone of the viruses she controlled, a tragic figure lost in the labyrinth of her own psychosis. The entire town of Madanapal stood watching, the silence of the night shattered by the flashing lights and the whispers of a community that could not comprehend how its most educated family had fallen into such darkness. The legal and medical aftermath revealed the diagnosis that the world suspected but feared to name: folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder. It is a rare and terrifying condition where a delusion is transmitted from one individual to another, spreading like a contagion. In the sealed environment of the Naidu house, the mother's overpowering delusions had infected the father and the daughters, rewriting their reality until murder became an act of love. The psychiatrists who later evaluated them in the government hospital in Tirupati and later in Visakhapatnam described a couple who were highly intelligent, lucid in many ways, yet completely severed from reality in this one specific, horrific aspect. The tragedy of the Madanapal case is not just in the death of two bright young women. It is in the terrifying realization of how fragile the human mind truly is. We build our lives on the foundations of logic, education, and social status, believing these things protect us from the abyss. But the Naidus prove that intelligence is no vaccine against insanity. In fact, their intelligence became the very fuel for their delusion, allowing them to construct complex, irrefutable justifications for their madness. They rationalized the irrational until it made perfect sense to kill their own children. Today, the house in Shivanagar stands as a silent monument to the tragedy. The gold medals, the PhD certificates, the musical instruments, they all remain as artifacts of a life that was erased in 24 hours of hysteria. The perfect family is gone, leaving behind a story that serves as a grim reminder. The darkness does not always come from the shadows of the unknown. Sometimes it grows in the bright light of the intellect, nurtured by isolation and fed by the very love that is supposed to protect us. The story of the resurrection murders ends here, not with a waking, but with a long, eternal sleep and a silence that will hang over the town of Madanapal forever.